Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're having a double header. The opening act, I'm delighted to say, is Karen Dionne, who's joining us for her second book. Now, she was here at the Poison Pen for The Marsh King's Daughter, which was a fabulous book, published in at least 25 other languages, nominated for various awards, and was a Poison Pen First Mystery Book of the Month. Do you remember all that?
Yeah, I do. It was such an exciting time. I wish I could be in the store now, but it's nice to be there virtually.
Well, it's lovely that you're here at all, and since it's 116, I honestly think that this is a better visit right now for you to come in virtually than to actually be here.
I can't imagine that kind of heat, no.
No, well, we don't like it either, but here we are. Anyway, Karen, it's interesting that Karen published her first novel, having been around the writers community for what? Something like 20 years in various roles before you became a published author.
Yeah, actually, I did publish a couple early novels during that time. I started an online writers organization called Backspace, and from that, as an offshoot of that, I started organizing conferences for aspiring writers in New York, and that was very satisfying, helping other writers connect with literary agents and learn about the business. And I also became very involved with the international thriller writers, all in that same time frame. I was managing editor of the Big Thrill for a while, and I helped shape up the debut authors program when the organization was new, and eventually I served on the board of directors. So I was writing during that time, but I was very much divided. I was doing a lot of other things. So what changed for me was in 2013, in the lead up to my Backspace Writers Conference, I happened to notice that an author who had gotten her literary agent at a previous conference was coming out with her subsequent novel. And I hadn't written anything. And it just hit me. And I said, I'm doing all these things on the edges of writing, but I'm not writing. So I went off the board of directors a year early. We made that our last conference in New York. And it wasn't too much longer after that I got the idea for The Marsh King's Daughter. So it was definitely a good call.
Well, it was a good call. Now, did The Marsh King's Daughter, I mean, it's a really unusual book, and for those who haven't read it or weren't here when you brought the book here, why don't you give us a run-up to The Marsh King's Daughter and how you came to write it?
Sure. So The Marsh King's Daughter tells the story of Helena, who for the first 12 years of her life, she lives with her mother and father in a remote cabin in Michigan's Upper Peninsula wilderness. It's surrounded by marsh or swampland. And during all that time, she never sees another person except her mother and father, which might sound grim, but she loves her life. It's all she knows. She's a little tomboy. She likes hunting and fishing and foraging. She finds out when she's 12 years old the reason they live like that is because her father kidnapped her mother. And she is the product of that crime. So that's half the story. In the present day part of the story, Helena is the mother of two little girls. She's living still in the Upper Peninsula, but she's put her past behind her to the point where even her husband does not know that she was once known as the Marsh King's daughter. And so her father escapes from the maximum security prison not far from her home. He disappears into the wilderness. So Helena, in the present day part of the story, has to use the hunting and tracking skills that he taught her when she was a little girl to find him before he can find her. So it's this cat and mouse game in the present, but the book goes back into the past about her upbringing, and yeah, it also incorporates elements of the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, The Marsh King's Daughter, which is where it gets the title from.
Well, it does, but why did she decide on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan? Because there are certainly other wilderness areas you could have picked.
Yeah, well, that's an area that's very personal to me because I lived in the Upper Peninsula for 30 years. Beginning in the early 1970s, my husband and I homesteaded there as part of the Back to the Land movement. So we bought 10 acres of property and we lived in a tent while we built our little cabin and carried water from a stream and sampled wild foods. Our oldest daughter was 6 weeks old when we moved to that tent that summer, so that was an interesting experience. So in writing The Marsh King's Daughter, setting the book in a place that I knew well, for me, it was almost like writing a memoir. Like Helena, at one point, she imagines what it must have been like for her mother to take care of an infant in these relatively primitive circumstances. And she pictures what it was like for her mother to wash diapers by hand in a bucket. Well, I didn't have to imagine that. Been there, done that, and it's every bit as nasty as it sounds. So, yeah, that's why I set the Marsh King's Daughter where it did. I love the Upper Peninsula. I love the natural world and the beauty and the isolation. So for me, it was a real joy to write a character who also loves that area.
Well, it certainly came across in the book how much you loved it. And, you know, it's interesting to me that the really unexpected success of, you know, Crawdads, Where Did the Crawdads Sing, takes place in a different wilderness area and with some parallels in the story. And, you know, you often wonder why one book really, you know, takes off to that level and another book doesn't quite do it. And, you know, it's not really about the quality of the book. I never can figure out, because some of the biggest bestsellers have been books I would never ever have predicted it would happen.
Yes, I imagine as a bookseller, if you had the secret to knowing which books were going to take off, you could really shape your business around that. But we're very grateful that you stock a wide variety because, and Marsh King's Daughter has been shown up on a few lists of what to read after you read Where the Crawdads Sing. I'm very happy to ride Crawdads' coattails.
Well, yeah, better coattails than no track at all. I certainly agree. But, you know, having read them both, in my mind, you know, I don't find a difference, and so I'm always intrigued. People have asked me over the years, time and time again, you know, to explain why the Firm, why the Da Vinci Code, why Twilight, and there's some sort of zeitgeist. There's something going on in society that it taps into given certain conditions. Like the Firm, for example, published the year that law firms were first allowed to advertise. And so the idea of a crooked law firm was not as outrageous, you know, as it might have been. And in fact, some people were so incensed by it, you know, that they would bond to that. I mean, I really wonder what people will write as a consequence of the current situation we're in, whether politics or pandemic or environmental crisis or whatever. What book is going to come along that is going to tap into one of these things and take off in some way, in a manner that most books will never rise to. And I'm not sure that it's great for an author's career to have that happen, to be perfectly honest. I think to trying to come back after a runaway success like that, very few people have ever managed to do it.
It's true. It's true. And you know, I've seen a lot of my author friends get published. I've been published a number of times myself. Each book has its own path, its own trajectory, and I'm thrilled with all that has happened for the Marsh King's Daughter. It was a bestseller in Germany and Sweden and Iceland, so I can't complain about that.
No, it was a great success. No question about it. I liked it a lot. Now, you've returned to the Upper Peninsula, right, in The Wicked Sister?
That's right. When my editor and I were having a conversation about what the next book should be, we both agreed that I write standalones. In The Marsh King's Daughter, I felt that I had told Helena's complete story, and to revisit her as a character.
We talked about whether there would be a sequel, and I remember both of us kind of agreeing that her story was done, and to write a sequel, it just could never live up to the drama and the tension that you gave to The Marsh King's Daughter.
Yeah, thanks. I couldn't agree more. And so, but we still wanted my follow-up book, which is of course The Wicked Sister, to share certain elements with The Marsh King's Daughter. So again, it's a psychological suspense. It takes place in a similar setting. It also has a fairy tale element, although I handled it quite differently than I did in The Marsh King's Daughter. So I think that readers they can come to either book first and enjoy the other one. The books are related, but not in that they share characters.
No, if anything, what they share is the landscape, and then, as you say, the fairy tale element. Unfortunately, the thing I'd most like to talk about the book is sort of a spoiler, so we could do that privately. But let's go back and set it up, because what you have is another young woman in a fraught situation. She's living in an insane asylum, or at least a home for the mentally ill, and she she volunteered to put herself there, if I recall this right.
Yes, she had a very traumatic thing happen when she was 11. It's no secret because this is in the opening pages that her parents die in a terrible shooting accident. And Rachel believes that she's responsible. She has fractured memories of that time, but she remembers enough that she's assumed that blame, that guilt for that. And so while she was initially sent to the mental hospital as an 11-year-old because she was catatonic, she came out of that, and she's an orphan now. She never really got well, and so yes, even once she was of age, she's in that mental hospital by choice because she feels that's all she deserves. She took her parents' lives, and she doesn't deserve to have a life of her own. This is her thinking on it. She's just overcome with guilt. But she finds out fairly early on in the novel that she probably did not do this terrible thing.
Well,
And
she at
so
least
that becomes
questions it.
the
She definitely begins to question it, and that allows you, to explore the whole idea that terrible trauma can really fracture memory or completely erase it, or suppress it, as the case may be. And so she's the unreliable narrator of her own life.
She is, and it's a pretty big tip off to the reader when the book opens with a character in a mental hospital that they're probably not a reliable narrator. But Rachel was a lot of fun to write because it's I can memory is such a tricky thing, and we can look back on our childhood and we have certain memories, and maybe our siblings remember it differently, and you think, well, how can that be? We were both there in the same place and time. So as a writer, it's a lot of fun to work with that sort of thing in a character.
Well, yeah, it absolutely is, but I think there's plenty of medical evidence that say that people, who are concussed or who have some sort of trauma generally can't remember it at all.
Right.
Ever, even when they're it's like a blank spot in their life that they don't really feel. So they are dependent upon witnesses or other people's memories of what happened, but she doesn't have that, or at least she doesn't think that she has anyone who could tell her what really happened. She's only got what she kind of pieces together or imagines happened.
Yeah. So it becomes there's quite a question mark that hangs over the whole book. And of course, Rachel's is only half the book. I'm also telling half of the book from the point of view of her mother, Jenny. And I think that was interesting because the reader knows from the first pages that Jenny is dead. Rachel believes that she killed her. So to write the book from, Jenny's point of view, present tense, as if it's happening now, I label the sections now and then. So Jenny has the story in the past. Because I feel like the past always informs the present. And, the answers that Rachel's looking for are in the past. So by having Jenny relate her side of things, then it gives the reader some insight into what Rachel is actually looking for.
Well, don't you think that crime fiction, almost demands a dive back into the past? Wherever we start in the present with the crime or the incident, whatever's going on, an important part of the inquiry and the detecting, if it's detecting, or the chasing, if it's a thriller, whatever's going on, demands going back into the past to see how we got to the focal point. And so for a writer, how you choose to structure that is, I think, often interesting in the choices that that a writer will make. I've read books recently where it's shuffled, where you either have alternating chapters, or you have 2 points of view, or you tell a story and then you reshuffle the deck and you tell it again from a different perspective, the whole thing. There are loads of story structures. So did you try out several before you lit upon telling it the way you have?
I did. The Marsh King's Daughter came to me very easily, and it also has that past and present structure. But The Wicked Sister, I probably tried out a dozen different ways of telling it before I settled on one, because the writing process is so interesting. Everything is a decision. Every time you put a word on the page, that's a decision. You chose that word for a particular reason. And likewise, the structure and who's going to be the main character and what is their voice going to be. So, yeah, it took easily a dozen tries before the book was really rolling along.
Well, an advantage to, well, there are pros and cons to writing series and pros and cons to writing books that are whole unto themselves. I think in a series, you're more often, you have to live by the decisions you made at the beginning, about much of it, who's going to be the point of view, what kind of a, is it a police procedural, is it an amateur sleuth, is it, what is it? And the structure, although some series authors do start to play with things, suddenly a third person narrator will come in, or, there'll be a section. So it's not like it's a straitjacket, but the way, when you're writing books that are whole unto themselves, you get to start at ground zero every time.
Yes, you do. And so, in some respects, it's a little more work because, as you say, you're starting from the beginning. But I get bored easily. I'm not sure I could write a series character. I'd get tired after several books.
Well, whatever works for you. It's always fascinating to me because, as you know, I talk to hundreds of writers every year, 54 this month so far. Zoom has just been extraordinary, and taking us out of the United States and into other countries as well, which has been a real benefit of doing things this way. But every author has a process that works for them, and I sometimes think some of it is superstition. If you wrote your first book and it worked, I think that oftentimes there's a tendency to stick with it because you knew you could, you can do it. You've done it once, and so you can, if you just kind of like do it again. In theory, it will work. But the real truth is, every book is a brand new challenge, isn't it?
That's right. And so, as an example, between my two novels, they both have a fairy tale element. And in The Marsh King's Daughter, I follow the structure of the fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen, The Marsh King's Daughter, quite closely in the story in the past. And there are even excerpts from the fairy tale at the beginning of those chapters that are set in the past. I didn't want to do exactly the same thing for The Wicked Sister. And so what I've done instead is I've taken elements from various fairy tales. Like, for instance, there are two Grimm's tales. One is called The White Snake, and in that fairy tale, the servant eats some of his master's special dish, and it gives him the ability to understand the languages of insects and animals. And so I have shades of that in The Wicked Sister because Rachel believes that she can communicate with animals on a deeper, almost a spiritual level. And then another fairy tale that I used is Grimm's Snow White and Rose Red. And that's a story about two girls who befriend a bear one winter who turns out to be a prince because, of course, every enchanted animal has to be something special in a fairy tale. So that there's a parallel to that incident or to that format in The Wicked Sister as well. But also, I was trying to create kind of a fairy tale vibe for the whole novel. So The Wicked Sister takes place at this beautiful log cabin that sits in the middle of 4,000 pristine wilderness acres in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And the acreage has been in Rachel's family for generations. Her great-great-grandfather built this log cabin as a hunting lodge. And so it sort of mimics the idea of a castle in the forest, right? And Rachel's great-great-grandfather who built the lodge also had a fascination with fairy tales. So, for instance, in the gun room, there's a large stained glass window that depicts the fairy tale The 12 Huntsmen, again, by the Brothers Grimm. And there's a beautiful main staircase that's made out of birch logs that are cut in half with the bark still on them, and the ends are painted in fantastic fairy tale scenes. So, and then Rachel, she grows up there with her sister. Obviously, there's a sister because the book is called The Wicked Sister. And the two girls, there's a large age difference between them, but they often go out into the woods and they act out fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel or Rapunzel or these sorts of things. So, that's how it's like the same but different. Both books have a fairy tale element, but I'm not handling it exactly the same in each book.
So what drew you to the fairy tales?
Oh, I cut my teeth on fairy tales when I was a little girl. In fact, here's my fairy tale books behind me right here. I love them. I think I read them when I was maybe 8, which was far too young for some of the material that's in them. But I have discovered, as I've been talking about the Marsh King's Daughter at book events, sometimes I like to ask audience, who read fairy tales when they were little, and honestly, almost every hand goes up. So I think it's that's that's why I enjoy writing or bringing in a fairy tale element in my novels now.
They used to come in colored books. Do you remember? There was the yellow book of fairy tales and the blue book of fairy tales and the red book. And then, of course, I actually began mine with reading Bullfinch's mythology, which is basically the Greek myths and the Greek fairy tales, and worked my way through all the rest. Brothers Grimm, being German, forests and adventures in the forest play a huge part because Germany is so heavily forested. Even some of the French ones, I've always thought of them as more over towards eastern France, more along the Alsace-Lorraine area where, again, heavily forested. The Romans gave up on Germany. I mean, they stopped at the Rhine because the forest was so scary and dark and intense and, old wood. And there's a surprising number of thrillers over the last 10 or 12 years that actually are titled Into the Woods or The Woods.
Right.
Tana French, Harlan Coben, I can't remember. Patrick, do you remember some others where, it's Into the Woods or The Woods, but the idea of children or people going into the woods and then never coming out.
Didn't Ruth Ware?
Right.
Yeah, I think Ruth Ware may have written one. We'll be talking to her on September 12th. But, I mean, it's not at all uncommon to put children or even adults in jeopardy by sending them into the forest.
Right. So I guess that's what I do.
Yeah, the Brothers Grimm, people tend to think of them as Disney, but they're really not. I mean, they're tough, and harm really comes to people in the forest. Those trolls under the bridge are not happy munchkin kind of people. They're seriously evil trolls and so forth.
Right.
The wolf.
But I think fairy tales overall, they don't all end this way, but there's a sense of justice to them. Like the happily ever after, and the villain gets their comeuppance one way or another, sometimes in very lurid ways. But yeah, so I think that's why fairy tales are so satisfying.
I think so too. They form the basis for quite a few operas. I'm a serious opera addict. And I'm thinking of a couple of Russian operas, Le Coq d'Or and there's another one that'll come to me in a minute, but involved. I went to a really imaginative performance in Santa Fe of Le Coq d'Or where they used modern technology. So they had a hologram of the golden cockerel because, otherwise he would prance around the stage, in a suit, which like the magic flute or something, but in this one, he's terrifying because he's 20 feet tall and, he's kind of flaming and all this other stuff. And stage technology now allows, I think, depiction of some of these kinds of fairy tale scary creatures in a way that before we had this kind of computer technology, we really couldn't do. But,
right.
Yeah. So, let me think. Is there a way... You have a real fascination with psychopaths. The Marsh King's Daughter was certainly one, and one will appear in The Wicked Sister. So, a real psychopath is a tough character to write and could indeed inhabit a fairy tale. What draws you to depict psychopaths?
Well, I think of Helena's father in The Marsh King's Daughter more technically as a narcissist. And rather than a psychopath.
Okay.
I'm not a clinical psychologist, so the distinction, there may be some overlap there. But specifically for The Wicked Sister, what inspired me to write that part of the book was some years ago, friends of ours adopted 3 siblings. The younger 2 did really well, But the older one, as the years went by, he just became more and more difficult, and he was violent, and he was hard to handle, and he was hurting the others. And they ended up, when he was about 12 years old, they had to institutionalize him. And that tragedy, it always stuck with me, because it's like, how do you decide as a parent when enough is enough? When do you give up on your child? They loved all three children, and the siblings loved each other, but they had to. There was a point where they had to say, this isn't working. We have to do something. And so that's really the thing that's at the heart of Jenny's story. She knows, that there's something wrong with her daughter, but she's trying to make a place where the daughter can be safe, where the family can be safe. She makes some really bad calls, and that's how the story progresses there. So, generally speaking, I've always been fascinated by people who overcome a less than perfect childhood to make something out of themselves. I had a wonderful childhood, and I can't think of any trauma or anything in my childhood, but I know that many children do not have a nice childhood, and they don't have nice parents, and yet they were able to go forward in life. Sometimes, we read accounts of people who maybe they become humanitarians, from a terrible background. So how does that happen? That really intrigues me as an author, and those are the things that I like to explore in my novels.
I always thought that Charles Dickens dealt with that quite a lot. When you look at Oliver Twist, why in that band of boys, why is there a good boy, and why is there, a really evil boy, and there's the whole nature nurture issue, and on and on. But what I do think is interesting is the way, and this has come up, when like a serial killer or a serial rapist, a real one, is captured, and their family, their spouse, if they have one, their neighbors and all are just astounded, with the serial shooting. The one that took place here in Tucson, the parents, and people always say, why didn't you know? Why didn't you recognize, that your child was going to be this? The horrible school shooting in, was it Connecticut? I think it was Connecticut, Massachusetts, where the boy killed his mother and then, blew. She knew all for ages that there was something really, really wrong with him, and so, it's a tough call. Do you gamble with your own safety? Do you gamble with other people's safety in an attempt to give this child some sort of a normal life, or do you make a call before tragedy happens? And I think these are such difficult things that there's no gold standard for deciding any of this.
That's true.
Right.
Yeah. And any parent, I believe firmly that almost every parent, they just do the best they can. I know that, I had 4 children, and I didn't always make the right decision, and if I could go back, I would change some things. But if I was put in exactly that situation again, I would make those same, poor choices again, because like I say, you can only do as a parent the best you can with what you have and what you know at the time. And so that's why I like the structure of a novel that lets the reader in on something bigger than what the characters can see, because it gives your readers a different perspective on the story. The characters are quite blinded, by what's happening, whereas the reader has the big fuller picture. And it's almost like in the monster movies, where someone's going to open the door to the basement and you're watching and you want to yell, don't go down there, but of course they don't know.
Well, I don't disagree with any of that. I guess what I was kind of working my way towards is there, at what point is there a difference between doing the best you can and just outright denial?
Right.
And that there was an episode of Grantchester, which is running on Masterpiece Theater, set, in Cambridge in the late 1950s. And in this particular one, the clergyman does the best he can and makes the call, and he thinks he's doing it right, and then discovers that he has not only misjudged it, but actually outrightly denied the truth of it, and he is so angry with himself that he behaves very badly for a while. And he's just sort of lost in him, because he has let himself down by, by let God down, himself down, and all the rest of it. And so there's that whole difference between doing the best you can and just denial,
Right.
and how is it that you blind yourself to those things that allow you to stay in denial or be in denial. And those are such slippery issues. I think they're fascinating.
They are, and we're trying not to give too much away about the book as we're discussing these things, but I can easily see book clubs, really diving into those topics, after having read The Wicked Sister, because, did Jenny make the right call in this instance, in that instance? That there's a lot of room for opinion, and
Well, there is. I'm discussing this in terms of, either she did or she didn't, and not trying to say it. And I wouldn't judge Jenny anyway, but I think there are
well,
books.
she ends up dead, so clearly she did not make a good choice.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
but I don't think that she got what she deserved. I don't think that's really the issue there at all either. One of the frustrating things often about doing events for books that are just published is that you really would like to talk about the ends or the hard issues in them, but they're spoilers for the reader, and so you can't. And Patrick, do you remember who it was that I was talking to not long ago, where we agreed to do like the 6-month follow-up, where by then we could assume everybody had read the book?
Oh yeah. Boy, who was that?
I'll think of it in a minute.
It was fairly recent.
Yeah,
Well, that's
and a well-known
yeah.
author. But anyway, we agreed that we would do the 6-month, book club. We would revisit the book, but we would assume by then, or we would tell people by then, given the fair amount of time they've had to read it, then if they want to join in, they are going to, either face the spoiler or should read the book first. And we did.
That's a great idea.
We did an event like that last January for a book that had come out in December, and as I said to, just can't think of who it was. It was a male author that I remember. Anyway, because of scheduling, we couldn't host her event. And then when I read her book, I recognized that nothing about the book was what you thought it was until the last either 2 or 3 pages, and so the entire book was about the end. And there was absolutely no point in doing an event about this book unless we made it a book club. So we did. And that's the way, because of the scheduling, we had like a 6-week or 2-month gap between publication and when she was actually able to come here. And so we made it a book club book event. And it was really fascinating and fun, because people had such different reactions, and,
Sure.
we all got to talk about it, and she was there to talk about why she made those choices, and that was fascinating as well.
Yeah.
So, you might want to promote a Wicked Sister 6-month book club.
That sounds great.
I'm serious. It
Yeah.
really could be a fun thing to do, to see how people react after they've had time to read it. So, Patrick, do we have any comments that you'd like to forward here?
Well, there's one.
Can you hear Patrick, or does he need to move up here? Sorry.
Do I need to move up a little bit, Karen? Can you hear me okay
Yeah,
now?
a little quiet. Yes.
Okay. Well, somebody was saying, was that Brad Thor, the author that you were talking
It
about?
might have been Brad.
Yeah. Let's see. There's one question where it just says, is it recommended to read either one of your 2 books before the other? Do they need to have read The Marsh King's Daughter?
No, they can be read in either order. And it's interesting to me now that The Wicked Sister is very, very close to publication. It comes out on Tuesday. Some of the Goodreads and Amazon reviews where readers have gotten an advance copy. The Wicked Sister is their first novel of mine, the first novel of mine that they've read. And then they go back and read The Marsh King's Daughter. And so it's interesting to me because in my mind, since it was written second, even as I was writing it, I was always comparing the 2 books, because how can I not? So it was kind of cool to think that people can come to The Wicked Sister having read nothing from me and, really enjoy it, and then go back and read The Marsh King's Daughter too. So that's kind of fun.
Right. You mentioned, some of these kind of mythological issues and stories and things. Do you think that, the woods and all of that are really primal for all of us, and they kind of represent sort of primal stories and fears. You know, I've heard people say that, you know, you can read The Forest as a kind of an inverted version of your own mind, you know, and all the different places you go into kind of speaks to these very primal fears and things that we all have.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. And I think the other aspect about where I set my novels is I think isolation plays a big role in my stories because it enables me to eliminate the extra noise. You know, a story that takes place in the city, you've got, you know, a lot of other characters there. Both my books, The Marsh King's Daughter and The Wicked Sister, there's a very small cast of characters, and it takes place essentially in one location. So the relationships between the characters becomes heightened because, you know, it's like distilled and condensed. In the case of The Marsh King's Daughter, it's all about Helena's relationship with her father, how she loves him when she's a little girl, and then she hates him, and then when she's 18, she reinvents herself, so she denies her father, and then by the end of the book, she has to come to terms with who she is and what her heritage was. And in The Wicked Sister, it's all about the relationship between the two sisters. So that's one aspect. You know, the woods just sort of conveniently allows me to explore, you know, those relationships in a very condensed and stripped down way.
Well, I think you couldn't really set either story in an urban setting or a suburban setting. You know, it absolutely wouldn't work. There needs to be. It's almost like an Agatha Christie country house murder. You know, there needs to be a boundary, a parameter within which the story, the action takes place, and that really is the same way that that classic Golden Age country house murder works. In that case, it's to limit the number of possible suspects. Otherwise, the detective could never work it out. But, you know, if you've fenced in, you know, like the 9 house guests that the old man who's writing his will and foolishly invited all of his relatives to attend it, you know, they're only the 9 possible suspects. Or very occasionally, Christie would do something really tricky, like, you know, and then there were none. But that's the basic deal. And you can translate that to a yacht. You can translate that to you know, a theater during a performance. Rex Stout wrote a Nero Wolfe book in which the whole thing takes place in a sealed banquet room. So the only potential suspects were the diners and the waiters, if I remember right. And so that's a very, very useful strategy for writing any kind of a book where you need a solution to a crime or a problem, is to give it a parameter.
That's right. Good point.
So what are you going to do next? At least I'm hoping there is a next.
There is a next, yes. And hopefully there won't be quite such a big gap between them. I'm working really hard to satisfy my readers and come out with the next novel in a timely way. The next novel is also going to be psychological suspense. And again, it takes place in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, this time in a small town called Grand Marais. There's a Grand Marais in Minnesota or Wisconsin too. That's not that one. This is a really tiny town called Grand Marais, and it's on the shore of Lake Superior. There's only 300 people that live in the town year round, and so the story has to do with I'm using the lake as a setting, similar to how I used the marsh in The Marsh King's Daughter and the forest in The Wicked Sister, because a lot of people don't realize, but Michigan is surrounded by 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. And so the Great Lakes they play a big role in our life. And when I lived in the Upper Peninsula, we would often go to Lake Superior and throw rocks in the water and have a picnic on the beach and watch the sunset. But Lake Superior is, you know, it's the largest of the Great Lakes. It's the deepest. Ships go down there all the time. And in fact, the stretch of shoreline where my novel takes place is known as the graveyard of the Great Lakes, because so many ships have gone down there, including the Edmund Fitzgerald that Gordon Lightfoot sang about. So that might give a little clue as to some of the story events that might happen in this next novel.
Lake Superior is a truly awesome force. I was trying to think. William Kent Kruger, Steve Hamilton, and Nevada Barr. I have all written books in which Lake Superior is the bound, you know, both the landscape and the menace, because the lake really is menacing. You know, I grew up on the shores of Lake Michigan, so the entire time that I was at Stanford as an undergraduate, I never could get the water right, because for me, the big water was always to the east. And, you know, on the peninsula, there was a bay, but the big water, the Pacific Ocean, was the wrong direction. And I was forever disoriented, you know, having grown up where Lake Michigan was my boundary. And I do think that you know, those childhood, your orientation to the world as a child is hard to shake.
It's true. And Lake Superior is just so isolated compared to the other Great Lakes, too. I was up that way last summer, a year ago, doing some book events in some of the smaller towns in the Upper Peninsula. And when you go up on the northern side on Lake Superior and you look out over the water, you see nothing, no ships, no boats, no nothing. And then from there, I went down to the Traverse City area, which is a lot more, you know, populated and resort-like. And every time I looked out at the water, there were boats everywhere. And I like the emptiness. I like the vastness. It just touches something in me. And so I spent a week up there researching for this novel that I'm working on. And once my book tour is over, my husband and I are going up there again to do a little bit of camping. We bought a little self-contained travel trailer. And so we're going to socially distance camp up there, which is easy to do because there's not a lot of people to start with. So I'm pretty sure the only time I'm going to come in contact with anyone is when I drive across the Mackinac Bridge and I give the toll taker my money for the fee for crossing the bridge. But yeah, I'm very excited to spend some time up there this fall.
It sounds lovely in the fall. That's the one thing I really miss living here in Arizona, because we have a beautiful spring of our own. We don't have dogwood trees, which I am used to from living in the South for a long time, but we have the Palo Verdes, which are gorgeous and full of yellow blooms and so forth. But I really do miss fall, which was, I have to say, the best season if you lived near the Great Lakes. It was always the most beautiful.
It is.
Yep, and the most temperate. So you don't have to tell us which one, but do you have another fairy tale structure in mind for this book? Are you sticking with that?
I'm going to deviate and not include a fairy tale element in the third book, but there is. Well, I guess it's not going to be a big secret. So there is a Hemingway element in this book that I'm bringing in the peripheral, because Hemingway, he spent a lot of time in Michigan. His parents had a place in the Petoskey area, and he also traveled to the Upper Peninsula. His Nick Adams short stories are based on the fishing that he did not far from where my novel takes place. So rather than work with a fairy tale, I'm going to work Hemingway into the story, just in a side way. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. But I have to have something to make it a little different, and that's what I'm hoping to work out for this novel.
Well, that'll be fun to explore. It's always good to have a little bit of a literary theme going on, you know, to see how it goes. Is there anything you'd like to recommend to people watching that they might like to read while we're waiting? By the way, I forgot to say this earlier, that Karen has very kindly signed copies of The Wicked Sister, and because it's not on sale till next week, they should be here by then, and we can offer them up to you, and I really recommend that you buy one. And if you haven't read The Marsh King's Daughter, definitely get a copy. You don't need it to read, as we've said, The Wicked Sister, but it's such a great book. I can recommend it. What would you recommend? Is there one book that you'd like to say, give a shout out to?
Well, there's Wendy Walker's Don't Look For Me, which is coming out in mid-September. I read an advance copy of that, and I really loved it. And then there's a book that's coming out in October. Rose Carlyle wrote a book called The Girl in the Mirror. And this takes place on a sailboat off the coast of Thailand, and it's a twin story. And I just loved it. In fact, there's a little story that goes with that book, because this spring, as you know, the shutdowns and the coronavirus was hitting, of course, it was a very upsetting time for everybody. And like a lot of my writer friends, I was really struggling to be creative, because it wasn't that writing did not seem important, but it was just so less important than what we saw happening in the world all around us. People were losing their jobs, they were losing their lives, and I'm making up stories about people that don't exist. It just didn't, it was a struggle. But what brought me out of that was Rose Carlyle's book, The Girl in the Mirror, because I just so enjoyed reading it, and I got caught up in the story. It took me into another place, another world. And so that made me realize, well, if she could do that for me with her story, then maybe I could do that with others, for others with my stories.
I think you're absolutely right. Reading has gone way up, and we've been interested to see how many older books, you know, classics, things that people are either revisiting or going to for the first time. Some people are tackling really big books that, you know, they wouldn't have felt they had the time to wade into when they were busier. And yeah, we all need to be transported out of where we are into some other place. Do you still have your advanced reading copy of Wendy Walker?
I do.
Well, I will swap you because I am hosting her and I can't get one, and that is really driving me absolutely crazy. So if you would put in the mail to me your advanced reading copy of Wendy Walker, I will send you a real book, which is my favorite book of the summer so far in terms of being different. It's called Fresh Water for Flowers by Valerie Perrin, translated from the French, and you will really love it. Is that fair?
Wonderful. That sounds great.
All right,
Yeah.
so we'll
Good
swap
deal.
books over the weekend then. I love this idea because I really want to read Wendy's book, and I'm going to feel like an idiot if I haven't by the time we get together sometime in, I think, mid-September or early September. So it'll be great. Anyway, thank you, Karen. It's been lovely to visit with you. Thanks for spending some time with us.
I really enjoyed talking to you, and like I say, especially seeing the bookstore behind you, I almost feel like I'm there.
Well, you are, really. And so are you all. So thank you very much for spending part of this evening with us. If you hang on for a few minutes, you will get to see John Sanford talking to Nicholas Griffin about what it was like to be in Miami as the 1980s was heating up. So good evening to you all.